Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second of three presentations in the SILGA Fall Speakers Series. My name is Tony Boot. I'm the Mayor of the District of Summerland and also the first Vice President of SILGA. I would like to acknowledge that this presentation is produced while on the traditional unceded lands of the Tk'emlúps Secwepemc people. I know the weather events of the last 2 weeks have put two of our SILGA communities, Merritt and Princeton, back in the news as they grapple with flooding that has devastated their towns. With colder weather and freezing temperatures now upon us, it is making infrastructure repairs and cleanup efforts even more difficult. We do have a little bit of good news, though. Earlier this week, some residents of Merritt were able to return to their homes as their wastewater treatment plant is back up and running. Boil water advisories and restrictions on water use remain in place, as well as advisories on how to test your well water if you're using that source of water. I spoke with Councillor Tony Luck this morning. He hopes to be able to get into his home this weekend. He's currently in Kamloops. Tony would like to say he is so grateful for SILGA members who have redirected staff to Merritt to help them out. Princeton is literally hanging on by a fire hose in terms of their water system. Yes, a couple of fire hoses are keeping the town's water system up and running. But cleanup efforts are underway thanks to amazing volunteers, including assistance from the Regional District Okanagan-Similkameen Emergency Operations staff, as well as RDOS Public Works staff. The Community Foundation of the South Okanagan has established a Princeton Relief Fund. You can visit Princeton CA to donate, and also donations are being accepted for all areas of BC that have been impacted by the atmospheric river through the Red Cross. We hope that the atmospheric rivers, perhaps in the forecast, do not worsen the situations in your areas or in any member areas. I would like to now welcome from TELUS, Jeff Cruikshank, General Manager, who will introduce our speaker for this session. Over to you, Jeff.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeff Cruikshank. Shortly, I have the privilege of introducing our speakers today, Dan George and Kelly Mortimer with Four Directions Management Services. In advance of that, a few words on behalf of TELUS. I'd like to begin by thanking the Secwepemc Nation, on whose traditional, beautiful, and unceded lands I'm privileged to be joining you today. And thank you to Allison Slater for organizing this important conversation for SILGA and bringing us all together in the spirit of partnership and collaboration. As you all know and have seen over the past year and a half, the pandemic has shown us that connectivity is a critically important service. TELUS has long recognized this importance and has been privileged to collaborate with Indigenous peoples, communities, and local governments to advance connectivity for over a decade, acknowledging that our work spans many traditional territories and treaty areas. In partnership with Indigenous governments and through effective public-private collaboration, we're making great progress on expanding our wireless and high-speed internet footprints and providing vital connectivity in rural and remote areas. This year specifically, we're very excited about the fiber builds taking place on the Upper Similkameen and Lower Similkameen Indigenous lands. However, there is still a long way to go in connecting rural and Indigenous communities here in BC, especially in remote areas where builds face high economic barriers. We must continue to find ways to build relationships and partner at all levels of government to create access to this critical connectivity and the opportunities it enables. As part of our own reconciliation journey and guided by Indigenous voices and frameworks of reconciliation, TELUS has developed an inclusive, culturally relevant Indigenous Reconciliation Action Plan, which leverages our core competencies to meet the diverse needs of Indigenous peoples in ways they want to be supported by TELUS. And as part of our response to the TRC's calls to action, it is vital that we partner with Indigenous-led organizations to support Indigenous-led solutions to enable positive socioeconomic outcomes. This doesn't mean creating solutions for Indigenous peoples, but rather coming to the table together to create the circumstances that lead to tangible and lasting outcomes that will be felt by generations to come. With that in mind, I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion on best practices for building relationships between First Nations and local governments, as those partnerships enable economic growth and opportunity. Now I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speakers. First, Dan George. Based out of Kamloops, Dan has been assisting communities, organizations, governments, and companies through negotiation and strategic facilitation for the past 30 years. Dan brings his vast experience, a MA in conflict analysis and management, certification as a professional facilitator, and director certification to each project he manages. In addition to his industry and government work, Dan has an extensive roster of First Nations clients to whom he provides services to in the areas of organizational development, strategic planning and facilitation, governance, leadership training, negotiation, and communications. A tireless advocate for reconciling the competing values and viewpoints of Aboriginal people, industry, and the Crown, Dan centers his efforts on the need to strengthen these valuable and transformational relationships. Kelly Mortimer has worked in the fields of Aboriginal title and rights, research, communications, and public policy since 2010. Before joining FDMS, she worked for the Shuswap Nation Tribal Council as the Director of Research and Communications for their Aboriginal Rights and Title Department, where she was responsible for a wide range of projects relating to social justice advocacy, Indigenous legal traditions, governance, and policy and legislative analysis. Take it away, Dan and Kelly.
Great. Thank you very much for the warm introduction. I want to begin by acknowledging the territory that we're gathered on here, the respective territories that all of us are gathered on. Raise our hands in respect to the elders, the matriarchs, the good people of these lands for allowing us to have this very important conversation. I also, too, want to acknowledge those who are affected by the atmospheric river and the extensive flooding we just our hearts go out to those that are affected, and we wish you a safe, prompt return back to your homes. Today, with our program, Kelly and I put together a brief program, and we're going to co-present elements of it. So, without further ado, Kelly, maybe we could just fire up our presentation, and we'll launch.
Perfect. I'll just get it going now. Oh, the host has disabled my screen sharing. Sorry, Mike, can you please? Thank you. Perfect.
So I got it, Kelly?
You do now.
So we always like to start our sessions with a little bit of laughter, some cartoons. I'm going to try these on for you. The first one here is this gentleman thinks that the rear defroster should take care of this by the time he gets to work. I think we've all followed somebody like this down the highway. This is that exact moment when you realize you speak 17 different languages. It's when you tear your little toe off. Now, here's a story I'm going to tell my kids. In 20 years, when kids ask about the 2020 toilet paper shortage, I'm telling them we had to drag our butts across the lawn in the snow, uphill, both ways. So I'm here today to join this very important conversation. I offer a Wet'suwet'en perspective. I'm not positioning myself in the room as a subject matter expert, but I'm going to share with you the information that I've learned during my lifetime through my interaction with our hereditary and elected chiefs and my scholastic studies. At the core of everything that we do is change. It's either you change or be changed. So when we talk about our relationships with Indigenous peoples in this country, you know, change is at the core of everything that we do. When I ask the question in the sessions that I facilitate, who wants change, most people put their hands up. Then you ask the secondary question, who wants to change? Most people put their hands down, sadly, because we'd rather endure a familiar pain than risk an unfamiliar pleasure. You ask people who wants to lead the change, and most people will vacate the room. In your position as municipal, local government leaders, you can't leave the room. You have to lead the change. And in that work, our followers will never know how hard the leader works to create a path, right? So I want to acknowledge all of the leaders in the room here who are working hard to do the next right thing. So when we manage complex change, it's important that we have a vision. So if we're trying to improve the relationship with Indigenous peoples, what is our vision? What's our aspirational vision? What does success look like some time horizon into the future? What skills do we require to give expression to a reconciliation action plan or whatever kind of strategic orientation we put in place to strengthen relationships with Indigenous peoples? How do we incentivize people to move towards that new space? What resources do they require? And if we have a measurable action plan, all those things lead to change. We know that if we don't have the vision, people are confused because we don't know where we're going. If we don't give people the proper skills, they get anxiety because you're asking me to do things I don't feel equipped to be able to undertake. If we don't incentivize people, people push back and they say, what's in it for me? If we don't have the resources, people get frustrated because you're asking me to do things that I don't have the tools and systems and methods to be able to fulfill. And if you don't have a measurable action plan, understanding that what gets measured gets done, you have many stops and starts. So I encourage you, if you're talking about changing the relationship, that you consider the top level of this graphic, being clear about your vision, your skills, your incentives, your resources, and the action plan. So a little bit of context setting to position ourselves in the room. Some myths about First Nations, that we're not organized, that we're not business minded, that we're not interested in working with the government, that we're opposed to all industrial development in our territories, and we're collective in our views, and that all First Nations get along. Those are all myths. They are not true. We are highly organized. We know that we need to participate in the economy if we want to smash poverty that has become normalized in far too many of our families. We know that collaboration is the way of the future, that none of us are as smart as all of us. We do know that the land has an inescapable economic component that we have to draw down on. And we're not a homogenous group of people, right? We don't all see things the same way and have the same ideas. So again, these are some myths that that we need to bust to make sure that people understand the position of BC First Nations. We have many different issues that face our people. We have poorer health status on average. We have lower levels of education. We have inadequate housing and crowded housing conditions. And this is particularly problematic within the COVID epidemic when you have multiple families staying in single family dwellings. They have on average lower income levels, higher rates of unemployment, higher rates of incarceration, higher death rates among children and youth due to unintentional injuries, and higher rates of suicide. So there's lots of things working against First Nations for them to be able to realize their full potential on their lands. We have a strong foundation to build off of, though. We have rich and vibrant cultures, including complex manners of governing ourselves. Prior to contact, we weren't just running around on the territory willy-nilly, right? We had relationships with one another. We had trade networks. We had complex governing systems. I am Wet'suwet'en. We still use our hereditary form of governance, which is our 5 clans and our 13 house groups. We have a deep connection to our territories. And oftentimes when you talk to our people, they will say things like, we are the land and the land is us, where our identity is inextricably intertwined with the territories that we were born in. We are one with the land and the water and all that the land and water contains. We have a burgeoning youth population below the age of 25. We find that our elders are living longer as well, which creates both opportunities and challenges within our communities. And I'm really happy to say that we have greater sophistication in the education, economic, and environmental areas. We have so many young men and women who are highly educated and are stepping into this space, that are business-minded, that are articulate. So I'm confident that we're positioned for success into the future. Opportunities you have as a municipal official is to be able to establish relationships with Indigenous peoples founded on respect for who they are, recognition of their title and their rights, and reconciliation. That we all, again, we're stronger together, we're better together within our communities. You have an opportunity to engage with Indigenous peoples in a manner that considers their history, their culture, their laws, their traditions, their stories, their needs, their aspirations. And Kelly and I always recommend the creation of a reconciliation strategy or a reconciliation plan that acknowledges the deep connection that Indigenous people have to their territories. if you really want to make an impact with your relationship with Indigenous peoples, it is foundational that you develop some kind of a strategy or some kind of plan that will give you some focus and give you some discipline in terms of moving your agenda forward. In the contemporary First Nations environment, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on here. Here's some 5 facts about First Nations people. In BC, there's 203 individual First Nation bands. So across the country, there's like 630 some thereabouts that were created through the Indian Act. And fully a third of those bands are in the province of British Columbia. So again, that's quite complex here. 203 First Nations bands that don't all see things the same way, or they don't all think the same way. Legally, reserves where our people have been placed on in the 1930s through the McKenna-McBride Commission, those reserves are under federal jurisdiction, but our traditional territory expands beyond reserve boundaries, and the province claims sole jurisdiction of this land. So if you look at our people, the Wet'suwet'en, we have 23,000 square kilometers of our traditional territory. Less than 1% of that was provided to our people as reserves. So again, we were hunters and gatherers taken off of our territory, and they tried to make, farmers out of us. You can have more than one chief, and I think that this is really important. In some First Nation communities, alongside elected chief and councils who are creations of the Indian Act, there exist hereditary chiefs who have a key role that must be acknowledged and understood. So I'm Wet'suwet'en. We're in the media here always as it relates to Coastal GasLink and Unistoten and Coyote Camp and those kind of pushbacks against industry. That when you look at Coastal GasLink, for example, there in Wet'suwet'en territory, there are 6 elected chief and councils who have all supported Coastal GasLink because they deal with poverty day in and day out. So they have to create an economy to be able to provide essential services to our citizens. And but once you step off of the reserve, it's the contention of our hereditary chiefs that that's their sole jurisdiction is the traditional territories, right? So again, our hereditary chiefs say no to the pipeline. Our elected chief and council say yes to the pipeline. And right now, that's why this tremendous confusion is being played out on the land base. So again, it's important to know who you're talking to. When the BC Treaty Commission process was started over 2 decades ago, there's 6 stages in the BC Treaty Commission process, and one stage is a statement of intent. And essentially what you needed to do was provide a letter to the BC Treaty Commission with a map which you felt was your traditional territory. We knew as BC First Nations that the BC Treaty Commission process was based on the land selection model out of the Yukon, 5%. Right, 5% of the land that you claim as your traditional territory is the kind of benchmark that the treaty was looking for. And so as a consequence, many of our people strategically drew bigger lines on a map so that 5% could be larger. So as a result, 110% of BC land has been claimed. And the only property or the only territory that is not contested in terms of overlaps or shared territories is Haida Gwaii. And lastly, BC is very unique because there are very few First Nations who have signed a treaty. Therefore, the majority of the land and the resources remain in unceded First Nations territory. And as a consequence, that results in a lack of clarity, role confusion, and ultimately conflict. In terms of our political structures, we have the BC Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief Terry Teegee. And Terry's responsibility is to represent the interests of all First Nations in British Columbia, all 203 First Nations. Then there's the First Nations Summit, and they have a task force and co-chairs, and they represent the First Nations who are engaged or plan to be engaged in the BC Treaty Commission process. And last but not least is the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and they too have presidents, vice presidents, secretary, treasurer, and they support those who do not subscribe to the BC Treaty Commission process because they believe that the provincial government has no place at the table because our relationship is with the federal crown. That's their contention. The task force, Lydia Whitsom, Cheryl Casimir, and Robert Phillips, along with President Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, Chief Don Tom, and Kupi Judy Wilson, Those 6 individuals, alongside of Regional Chief Terry Teegee, form the First Nations Leadership Council. So essentially what the Leadership Council has done is tried to come together and find ways of collaboration between different First Nations entities in the province so that we could move our agenda forward quicker and with more impact. So the next 2 sections, I'm going to turn over to Kelly to help me out here. Over to you, Kelly.
Thanks. So for understanding and implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we wanted to spend some time covering these foundational documents, just knowing that the UN Declaration is something that Canada and BC have both completely endorsed and now have turned into legislation to implement. And as municipal leaders, that work is also going to fall on to you. So what is the UN Declaration? It's the most comprehensive human rights instrument that specifically addresses Indigenous peoples' economic, social, cultural, political, civil, spiritual, and environmental rights. How it came about was decades-long work led by Indigenous peoples themselves from across the globe who worked together to advance this comprehensive document that eventually was adopted by the UN General Assembly in September of 2007. And that was also at the time when the phrasing of Indigenous peoples became the standard. Before Indigenous peoples was used, the term Aboriginal peoples was commonly used. And it was by coming together across the globe that Indigenous peoples themselves said we want to be referred to as Indigenous peoples, which is why we use that as the standard now. And it's a term that applies to all Indigenous. So in a lot of this presentation, we've talked about First Nations specifically, and Indigenous peoples is a bit of an umbrella term. So in the General Assembly, when the UN Declaration was first voted, 144 countries voted in favor of it, 11 abstained, and 4 voted against it. And the 4 that voted against it were Canada, the US, New Zealand, and Australia. And the reason why they originally did this was because of the concept of free, prior, and informed consent being embedded into this document. They were incredibly uneasy about it, and as such, felt the need to actually vote against it. So UN Declaration is not enforceable. It's an aspirational document, whereas unlike a convention or a covenant or treaty, that those are enforceable under international law, with an example being like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So for UNDRIP to become law in Canada, legislation was actually required to make this happen. To just say Canada fully endorsed it didn't actually make it implementable, but now it is. So in BC, we were the first province across the country to do this. They created the DRIPA legislation in November of 2019. And that would be the purpose of which is to implement UNDRIP in its entirety. And this legislation is called DRIPA, and the action plan for how the province intends to implement UNDRIP has been released in the draft form. So there is an action plan that you can review on how BC is actually going to move forward with implementing UNDRIP. And that will include aligning all of provincial laws, regulations, and policies to be in alliance with it. And then as of June this summer, Bill C-15 was passed federally, which is also going to give Canada's legislation to implement UNDRIP, and that will require the federal government to work collaboratively with First Nations and other Indigenous peoples to develop a national action plan to implement UNDRIP. As of this time, no action plan has been developed or released yet, and now that they have their cabinet in position, we're expecting to be hearing more updates about what this will look like in implementation soon. So the other important document that is the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. And how to understand and implement these calls to action is important work in the reconciliation space. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission provided those directly or indirectly affected by the legacy of Indian residential school system an opportunity to share their stories and experiences. Between 2007 and 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission spent 6 years traveling across Canada and heard from more than 6,500 witnesses. This created a historical record of the residential school system. And in June 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission held its closing event in Ottawa and presented the executive summary of their findings, which was included in a multi-volume final report and included the 94 calls to action or recommendations for further reconciliation between Canada and Canadians and Indigenous peoples. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself came out of the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, which is the Indian Residential School Survival Settlement. And that's, it's really important, I think, to recognize that the reason the Truth and Reconciliation Commission even came about was because Canada was taken to court over what happened, and the experiences of so many survivors were brought to light, and they recognized the need that these stories needed to be told. So the calls to action come out of that class action lawsuit. So how are they being implemented? The governments of Canada and the province of, the governments of Canada and the province of BC have stated that their commitment to fully implement the Commission's findings. This commitment is currently expressed in every provincial and federal minister's mandate letters, and the government is only responsible for approximately 80% of the recommendations made. They alone can't make progress on the implementation of the TRC's findings. We all need to pick up the calls to action, identify the ones that pertain to our fields, areas of influence, and implement them through some concrete actions. So how do we then take this forward, right? We all need to find our call to action. So we've gone through them and we've identified the calls to action specifically pertaining to municipal governments. So for number 43, we call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation. So our question to all the municipal leaders here today is, have your municipalities here formally adopted UNDRIP? That would be a step forward in implementing the calls to action. Number 47, we call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to repudiate concepts used to justify European sovereignty over Indigenous peoples and lands, such as the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, and to reform those laws, government policies, and litigation strategies that continue to rely on such concepts. So we ask all of you here, are you aware of these doctrines? And if so, have you formally repudiated them? Number 57, we call upon federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to provide education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and the treaties on Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This will require skill-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So we identify that we're working towards this today. This presentation is an opportunity to provide education. So what further education areas of interest would you like to pursue in your journey towards reconciliation? We recognize that reconciliation isn't a destination, but a journey. There really isn't a point where it's going to be accomplished in the sense of it's always going to be an ongoing relationship that you have to nurture and take care of and invest into. And lastly, number 75, we call upon the federal government to work with provincial, territorial, and municipal governments, churches, Aboriginal communities, former residential schools, students, and current landowners to develop and implement strategies and procedures for the ongoing identification, documentation, maintenance, commemoration, and protection of residential school cemeteries or other sites at which residential school children were buried. This is to include the provision of appropriate memorial ceremonies and commemorative markers to honor the deceased children. And in light of all of the discoveries that came about this summer, starting here in Tecumlip's territory, this call to action number 75 is more important than ever. So we ask, have you begun to develop and implement strategies and procedures towards this important commemorative and protective work? So Dan, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you very much. That was almost seamless. Can't control it, Kel.
Let me just try one more time.
Great.
There you go.
So this is a graphic that I use when I teach governance at the local community level, recognizing that many of us are virtual learners. So when I present this, I'll present it as if I'm talking to a chief and council, so you can kind of understand how we organize ourselves here. Top right-hand corner is the breath of our grandmothers and our grandfathers. It's our Indigenous worldview. It's how we see the world and our place within it. It's reflected in our language, our culture, our traditions, our beliefs, our practices. It's the bedrock that we stand on as Indigenous people. You get to the mountaintop level, and this is where leadership is. And this could be municipal leadership, It could be elected chief of councils, hereditary leadership, boards of directors. And essentially, as leaders, you have to make space for your people to take their rightful place within the socioeconomic fabric of the territory. So what does that look like, right? Then you, from the treetop level, as if you're using a policy carver governance model, that's where you'd only have one employee, and that employee would then take that information and make sense of it. And then lastly, at the river's edge, we're after results, right? Sadly, poverty has become normalized in far too many of our families, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and we have to do better to make sure that our children have food in their stomachs, warm shelter, and an opportunity to realize their full potential. So when we think about the mountaintop level, that's kind of nation to nation relationships that are created between the Crown. For example, we are going up to Fort St. John tomorrow and meeting with Treaty 8, and so they're having meetings amongst themselves, and then they're going to be then meeting with the provincial and federal Crown. So that's kind of nation to nation. Government to government is an opportunity for our local, regional, provincial governments, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to find ways and means to work together. And at the community level is where, again, we are all part of the communities here. So we need to find ways and means that we can begin to support each other better. And we know through the Union of BC Municipalities, a lot of work is being done on community to community initiatives, trying to formalize relationships between Indigenous peoples and local and regional governments. As Kelly spoke earlier, Canada has a commitment to reconciliation. Our Prime Minister, says there remains no more important relationship to him and to Canada than the one with Indigenous peoples. He goes on to say, with respect and dignity, they remain committed to moving forward along the shared path of reconciliation. So they are moving in that direction, as described earlier by Kelly. The provincial government has the same thing in place as well. And in fact, the provincial government's a little bit further ahead than the federal government in terms of the implementation of UNDRIP. Kelly referred to it as the DRIPA action plan here earlier in her presentation. That was brought into force on November 28th, 2019. And the Declaration Act establishes the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People as the framework for reconciliation. And Kelly also noted that in every mandate letter that the Premier has given to his ministers, there's a statement in there about what they're going to be doing to advance UNDRIP and what they're going to be doing to advance the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action that are specific to their responsibility area. And then that is kind of reflected in their service plan that they have to create, right? So again, a lot of work is being done, led by some very, very capable people. And there's other examples when we look around in preparation for this presentation, and we look around and see what others are doing. I can't pronounce that there, Kelly. That's you.
What's that I can't pronounce that one either. But there are some Vancouver Island First Nation communities. And they are part of the Manoth Treaty, one of the modern day treaties that have been successfully negotiated through the BC Treaty Commission process. And here they've developed kind of an orientation guide of how they're going to be working together. And again, opportunities here for you to learn from Strathcona. The City of Vancouver created a new equity framework. I believe when Ginger Gosnell-Myers was working for them. The equity framework has been grounded in the fact that Vancouver is located on the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and is built on the history of colonialism and white supremacy. So the City of Vancouver must confront institutional and systemic racism, and the new equity framework will provide us an opportunity to build on our current work and renew our commitment to eradicating racism, reducing harm, and upholding the rights and dignity of all people. Right. So again, they've gone here and they developed a framework, and they didn't only develop the framework, they paid attention to the implementation and the evaluation of the framework as well. The Port Alberni City Hall, Hoopakasath Tashot First Nation flags fly at Port Alberni City Hall, and the addition of permanent Indigenous flags are a response to reconciliation. So right outside the local government offices, our flags are flying in Port Alberni.
So again, an indication of reconciliation, highly symbolic. Vernon City Council adds territorial acknowledgements to their meetings. And in March, Chief Byron Lewis of the Okanagan Indian Band said the First Nations relationship with the city is more important than an acknowledgement of unceded territory, as has become popular in many cities. It would be a nice gesture, but you want substance. If there's going to be a relationship, you have to have substance to it. You can say something, but like my grandfather used to tell me, actions speak louder than words. That's what really counts. So you're starting to see many different groups are starting to do that acknowledgement, and I think that's a really good start. But what Chief Byron Lewis is saying here, and Kelly and I agree with them, you got to do more than that, right? People are looking to you for leadership. You've been, you have a tremendous influence, and how can you use that influence to bring us closer together as people, rather than doing nothing? And oftentimes that results in us being separated as people. To Kamloops and the city of Kamloops, new banners are going to be installed on city street poles later this year, promoting partnerships between Kamloops and Kamloops to Secwepemc. And the Kamloops mayor, Ken Christian, said he likes the simplicity of the design, which he noted captures both governments in one valley. Again, both governments in one valley coexisting together for greater benefit for their shared clients. Many other things are happening with industry. So industry has TC Energy has a reconciliation action plan, for example. University of Victoria has put in place an Indigenous plan that they're working towards. Canada Post has an Indigenous and Northern reconciliation strategy that can provide some guidance and ideas. And recently, Kelly and I worked with Tourism Chilliwack to help them develop a living tourism action plan that was reconciliation based and seemed to be probably the first of its kind in Canada, I think. So we're quite proud to be associated with that. To learn more, there's all different kinds of books out there. My good friend Bob Joseph, has a book, Indigenous Relations, Insights, Tips, and Suggestions. And he also has a second book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. Books that are more local and have more of a local impact here in the Southern Interior would be a book like At the Bridge by James Tate. Marianne Ignis and former Cookby Ron Ignis's book, Secwepemc People, Land and Laws, is another good resource. Unsettling Canada, Art Manuel and Grand Chief Ron Derrickson. There's a First People Law blog that you can look at. Indigenous Canada, there's a course at the University of Alberta that was, what was that fellow's name? The actor that gave the big shout out.
Dan Levy.
Dan Levy gave the big shout out from Schitt's Creek, Dan Levy, and drove a lot of people towards the University of Alberta site. And it's a very, very good site. And I would encourage you to take the course there. And last but not least, Kelly has worked with me to develop a podcast called Reconciliation Road. And so we've had about half a dozen, I think, interviews so far. We're just getting our legs underneath us. The last interview was with Cookby Mike Labordier from Whispering Pines. And we have an upcoming one, I believe, on Monday, November 29th with Dr. Bonnie Henry. And so, again, look for those, look for our podcast and support us. We'd appreciate that. Speak to this one here, Kelly, please.
The Sir Wilfrid Laurier Memorial is an incredibly important document that was written in 1910, and we bring it up because it really has an importance to a lot of the nations that we know that the municipal leaders here today also live within the territory. So it's the Secwepemc, the SILGA, so the Okanagan, and the Anilkamik got together back in 1910, organized themselves as three nations to pen this letter to then Prime Minister Sir Wilfrid Laurier to talk about what they were experiencing as a result of colonization and the treatment that they were receiving, but also had a very forward-thinking vision on what it was that what their expectations were and how they wanted to live together as partners in this land. And to this day, that this memorial is always cited when First Nations leaders from these three nations are asked sort of what it is that you're looking for when it comes to a relationship with government. And oftentimes you'll hear the response being exactly what our ancestors said in the Sir Wilfrid Laurier Memorial, that the messaging contained within this document, even though it's 111 years old now, is still just as relevant and needed to be implemented as it was back then. So we'll just leave with this one quote that I think is really important. So these people wish to be partners with us in our country. We must therefore be the same as brothers to them and live as one family. We will share equally in everything, half and half, in land, water, and timber, etc. What is ours will be theirs, and what is theirs will be ours. We will help each other to be great and good. So that was the message from 1910 that the chief said, this is what we want in the relationship. And from everything that's been shared with us, it still rings true today that that's what they want.
Thank you very much, Kelly. And at the beginning, we noted the 215 souls that were here in Kamloops, the children. It's now 7,912 across the province, right? We're not across the country, excuse me, and we're not hearing that in the media anymore, right? So I wanted to close with that and just open myself and Kelly up to any questions that you might have, and we thank you for your patience in listening to us.
Thank you so much, Dan and Kelly. That was a fantastic presentation. So important as to guide our work and improve our relationships with First Nations neighbors. You've given us a lot to think about with your presentation. We're now ready for the question and answer portion of this session. Please use the chat feature on your Zoom feed to ask Dan or Kelly a question. Should we start with the one from Barb Weeb of the District of Lillooet? I would like some suggestions on how to move forward with truth and reconciliation, as I live in an area where there are several bands that don't always see eye to eye with each other, and you did speak to that. It is difficult to make progress on programs and decisions that also impact our First Nations governments when we are faced with conflict between the bands.
You want to try that, Kelly?
Well, I think firstly, the conflict between the bands is nothing that you would be expected to solve. So it would be important to reach out to each of them individually and develop those relationships as much as you can with them, recognizing that bringing them together as one homogenous group probably won't be the solution. And I also think it's important when developing programs and services that could impact First Nations people or about First Nations people, if you're doing this work and you find that you're on a committee, in a council, or in a working group, and you're trying to come up with strategies for how to engage or benefit a group of people, but you look around and they're not in the room with you doing it, I would be skeptical of any recommendations or conclusions coming from that group. So as much as you can, involve them in the planning of the work that you're doing to try to build those relationships sort of from the ground up.
Yeah, and at the core of every relationship, a good relationship is trust, right? And unfortunately, there's a healthy dose of mistrust and distrust out there. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to be vulnerable and to take the step and to admit that we might not have all the answers, right? But we can certainly lead with good questions that are designed to bring us closer together. I think part of the rub at times too between local governments and First Nations communities is the lack of clarity about who does what. And, so what do we do separately and what do we do together? And how do we leverage the opportunity space for greater impact for all of us in the communities that we live in, right? So, Lillooet, as you've noted, is surrounded by many different Indigenous communities. And you all have, the desire to protect the land and provide essential services to your respective citizens. So, again, it just begins with having that conversation with one another, and again, in acknowledging, as I said earlier, we don't all see things the same way. So if you have that expectation, you're going to be frustrated.
Great, thank you for that those thoughtful answers. The next question comes from Councillor Kathy Sinclair, who is with the City of Kamloops. What are your thoughts on including Indigenous representation on regional district boards?
I think that's critical, right? One of the things when I was being introduced is that I got my director designation from the Rotman School of Management to be able to sit on different boards and corporate boards, right? And I think part of the challenge that we have within this country is diversity in the boardroom. And I think we need to do more to make sure that women are represented around the table. Disabled people are represented around the table. Indigenous people of color are represented around the table, so that the actual decision-making table or leadership table reflects the community. Right? You hold up a mirror, and people can see themselves reflected in the composition of local government. So I think it's critical to be able to do that together.
Dan, maybe I'll just add, I agree that it's absolutely critical, but if you're going to have the participation on the board, I think it's important that board members are educated about Indigenous reconciliation and rights prior to that board member starting. So that way the responsibility of education about Indigenous people and rights and title doesn't fall into that board member to have to educate others. So often we see that and hear about that happening, where a new board member is appointed, and anytime there's a question about anything to do with Indigenous rights or territories or issues, always falls to that one person, and then they're put into a position of having to educate all the time. And it gets, from what we hear, it gets exhausting. And it's just frustrating that, or if there's, any working groups being established or anything like that, they tend to just get the Indigenous offering. So treating them like all board members, and also making sure that your board members are brought up to speed, so that way they can truly collaborate in a meaningful way, I think is important.
Thank you again for those answers, Kelly. I think that what you were just saying really speaks to the calls to action that you spoke about earlier today. We need to do a whole lot of work. Non-Indigenous folk need to do a whole lot of work to get through to the truth before we can even start the reconciliation. Dan, what you said about diversity around the board and council tables certainly strikes a chord with me. I do want to let members know that the Regional District Okanagan-Similkameen put forward a UBCM resolution, not this past year, but the year before, and it was something that had been passed along and was totally supported at the UBCM convention and passed through to the provincial government. So there is work being done on that, and I think it's critical work. The next question we have is a question that I have. And Kelly, again, speaking about the calls to action, number 57 is one that we've worked at a fair bit at the District of Summerland. My question, actually it's a comment and then a question. We know that government work is critical to building relationships and advancing reconciliation. So I mean, regional district, local government work with First Nations government. Do you have any comments on how local governments can change the organizational culture so that staff too is working on reconciliation and is able to incorporate this into their daily operations?
It's a great question. It's sometimes hard to communicate to all members of your organizations and public servants maybe how this work is important to what they do day in and day out. I remember one time we heard about an internal study done with the BC Hydro Crown Corporation, and they asked their staff in a survey, how important do you think reconciliation is to the work that BC Hydro does? And it was rated like 9 out of 10. Most employees felt it was very important. But then when asked the question, how important is it to the work that you do? It was rated extremely lowly because they felt it was only the responsible of those people who were working in their Indigenous relations office and those managers who were kind of in job title tasked with it. So they didn't see it as a personal responsibility. They agreed, yes, it's important, but no, that's not my job. That's somebody else's job. So part of the work is how do you communicate to public servants that it's all of our jobs? We all need to do this. And that was why when we even bring forward things like the calls to action, we kind of phrase it in that way that you need to find your call to action. What's something that you can do as an individual, as an employee within your system that has certain responsibilities and influence. And then also maybe broadly, as you leaders here today can think about what can the overall organization do. So there's different levels of the system where influence can be had. And it's about educating people to be inspired by it, that I find when it comes to work of intercultural competency and education, it's very hard to make it mandatory. People will resist it if it feels forced upon them and it's not genuine. So there has to be ways that this information can be accessible and opportunities are provided where people can have a safe space to engage and ask questions, recognizing that sometimes for people it's new information or they've been told something completely different, or they feel that a lot of change is happening very quickly and it makes them uncomfortable. So how do we allow the time and space for conversations to happen in a meaningful way so that they can feel confident and moving forward in this space? And I think it really speaks to that slide Dan shared at the beginning of the presentation where he talked about you need to have the vision, the resources, the skills, and the action plan all in place. And if you don't, people get nervous. And one of those things really is the skills. So if you're asking your employees to, participate in an organizational culture that's towards reconciliation, do they feel that they have the skills to even do that? And being able to provide that training and support to your organization is important. And then also simply, if whenever possible, hiring First Nations people within the system too.
And the only thing that I would quickly add is when you talk about organizational culture can be referred to as the way we do things around here or the tone at the top of the organization. And as leaders, you have tremendous influence over your rank and file within your infrastructure. So if as leaders at your decision-making leadership table, reconciliation is important to you and you can role model that to your rank and file, that trickles down through the infrastructure. Right. But if at the leadership table, if we're not embracing reconciliation, right, how can we expect our rank and file staff members to embrace reconciliation? Right. So again, that tone at the top, I think, is really important. And I just want to acknowledge the fact that we're even having this conversation is the openness being expressed by local and regional leadership to learn more about this space, about how we can work more cooperatively and collaboratively together.
Great. Thank you for those thoughtful answers again. Dan, one thing that you just said is with the leadership we have to lead. We have to show that this can be done, and it'll trickle down through to the organizational culture. My hope is that as part of the Call to Action 57 is that it will also disseminate into the community, so they see through their leadership, through the people that are working in the organization, in the municipal or regional government organization, that this is being modeled there, and this is what we'd like to see in our whole community. And one last thing, Kelly, that was a great example that you gave. Really, really good example. Makes it crystal clear. So we don't have any more questions and answers for Dan or Kelly today, but I thank you for the questions that came forward, and again to Dan and Kelly for answering those questions so fulsomely and for joining us today. I just want to give a couple of my personal comments on the presentation. Appreciated the little bit of icebreaker and the laughter heals. The change management introduction for me was the perfect way to open this more serious part of your presentation. And managing the complex change, Kelly spoke to that. it was really great. That was a fantastic graphic that clearly shows what needs to be done. We all know that people fear change because they don't understand what the change will bring. And just like you said with building the skills, if you understand what needs to be done, then that will help to allay the fear. At least that's my thoughts on that. I so appreciated your telling the SILGA members about the difference between chief and council and the hereditary chiefs. Certainly some of us know that already, but for the people that don't have that understanding, that was great. And for those of us that already knew, it's always good to be reminded of the First Nation government structures and really how different they can be from ours. I think in closing, for my personal remarks, the thing that really struck me and was very helpful are the resources that you gave at the end. A number of books came up. There was the mention of the memorial. And I think it's so important that we all understand what we can do as individuals and as leaders in our communities to learn the truth and understand the Indigenous worldview. So thank you again for that very good presentation. I'd also like to thank TELUS for sponsoring this session and Trans Mountain Expansion for their continued sponsorship of the SILGA Speakers Series. As well, thanks to Mike and Bonnie from Lee's Music for providing the AV services for the series, and our intrepid executive director, Allison Slater, for getting this all together. And thank you to you for participating in the speaker series. It's just a reminder that our next speaker will be Ministry Katrine Conroy of Flynn Row and Rural Development. Please note that the date of this session will be moving to January the 12th, starting at noon. And remember to pencil in the SILGA AGM and convention in your calendar from April the 26th to 29th. At this time, we are planning to meet in person in Salmon Arm. And finally, because we won't be seeing you again before Christmas, I hope you're able to enjoy the holidays with your family and friends. Take care, everyone, and stay well. Thank you. Good job. Thank you.